However, without this honesty, laws do not have validity as the essence of consciousness, nor similarly does the testing of them count as an action within consciousness. On the contrary, these moments, appearing each by itself immediately as a reality, express in the one case an invalid establishing and existence of actual laws, and in the other case an equally invalid immunity from them. The law, as a specific law, has a contingent content, and this means here that it is the law of a single consciousness and has an arbitrary content. To legislate immediately in that way is thus the tyrannical insolence which makes caprice into a law, and ethical behavior into obedience to such caprice, obedience to laws which are merely laws and not at the same time commandments. So, too, the second moment, insofar as it is isolated, means testing the laws. Moving the immovable means the insolence of a knowledge which argues itself into a freedom from absolute laws, treating them as an alien caprice.
Paragraph 434 is, in many respects, quite an exciting one just from the very language that Hegel is using. We have a contrast between honesty or Ehrlichkeit and sort of a basis of capriciousness, Willkür, and insolence, Frevel. Right? These are words that have very strong senses to them. We have a strong contrast here over the way in which laws are supposed to work within and for consciousness. So I'm just mentioning here at the very beginning because when you can, read the German and you see some of the sort of the language itself, we don't get a lot of places in Hegel where the very terminology that he's picking has these kinds of resonances. So I think we have to be attuned to that when it does happen. Much of the time his prose is more abstract and he's not he's not giving us that sort of thing. So we have to seize it when it does happen. Anyway, on to the analysis. So he says, without this honesty, laws do not have a validity, a Gültigkeit, in two ways. We have laws, and we've seen these two moments now of giving laws and testing laws, right? Giving laws, he says, here is the essence of what not all consciousness necessarily, although law giving does play an important role at many points. Think about forcing the understanding. But here he's talking about ethical consciousness or practical consciousness. Giving laws really is at the core of this, Hegel thinks. In that, he is really in agreement with many people throughout the history of philosophy. You might think, first of all, about his predecessor Kant, but it's not as if Kant is the only person who thinks that laws are really central, really at the core of practical activity. The notion of natural law that we find in a very dim way in Aristotle and somewhat stronger in the Stoics, and then worked out very clearly by Thomas Aquinas, and then worked on further by his successors, not predecessors. They're obviously not going to be reading him if they're his predecessors. We find that sort of universalization as well. And we can find many other examples of this. This is really core to what it means to be a human being. This is not just in Western culture, but also this process of universalization. We see this in other cultures that engage in moral decision-making, discussion, and disagreement. So giving laws is at the essence of consciousness. And then testing laws, Hegel says here, is the action within ethical or practical self-consciousness. These two go together, as we've seen. As Hegel just remarked several paragraphs before this, if we isolate them from each other, we find that they don't have validity, Gültigkeit, worthwhileness, you might say. But when we put them together, and we do so under the auspices of this honesty, this Ehrlichkeit. If you think about what this honesty means, it's not just about truth-telling, it's about honoring, giving Ehre to what deserves honor, giving. When we talk about respecting something, right, that is, I think, along the lines of what Hegel is calling Ehrlichkeit here. So Hegel suggests that this Ehrlichkeit, this honesty, is needed there for laws to have validity in consciousness. Now, he says, on the contrary, these moments appearing each by itself immediately as a reality, isolated again out from their connection, express in the one case an invalid establishing an existence of actual laws, in the other case an equally invalid immunity from them. So when we break them apart and we don't find some way to integrate them, what we get is, in some respects, something like the inverted world of the force and the law-giving nature, the world-creating nature of force in the understanding section. So what does he mean here? Let's look at the actual terminology here. Invalid establishing, aufstellen, and existence, sein, of these laws. This corresponds to the giving laws, which is supposed to be at the essence of consciousness. So it's possible for us to erect, aufstellen, to set in place laws that are themselves invalid, or we do so in an invalid way. We're going to see how that plays itself out in just a moment. And their very existence, their very being, could be, in some respect, wrong. Right? Testing laws, the action within consciousness. Corresponding to this, we can have an invalid immunity, as Miller's translating it. We might also use the term exceptioning, right? Befreiung, freeing oneself of these laws, saying, well, they don't apply to me, or I get to adapt them to my particular circumstances. The honest consciousness is honest because there's universality there. Here we have, and this is where Hegel uses these wonderful terms, right? Caprice, Willkür, and insolence, Frevel. Audacity would be another way of translating it. When we say, I don't believe you had the guts to do that, we're talking about Frevel there, right? When we say Willkür, could be caprice, it can be arbitrariness. We can think of other ways of rendering this as well. But Hegel uses these terms to talk about a subjective consciousness that is becoming, subjective against the universal. It's not that subjectivity is bad. As a matter of fact, we have to have subjectivity, right? We can never escape from it. But there's good subjectivity and bad subjectivity. This is bad subjectivity when it comes to laws, and it invalidates them as laws. So he says here, the law, as a specific law, has a contingent content. This means here that it is the law of a single consciousness and has an arbitrary, a Willkür content. Where have we seen this play itself out before? Think back to just a few sections earlier in this massive reason section to the law of the heart and the dynamic that played itself out there. The law of the heart was a law for that individual self-consciousness, but then it attempts to impose that on others, right? So we have an invalid establishing or erecting or imposing of the law. So Hegel goes on and says, to legislate immediately in that way is thus the tyrannical insolence which makes caprice into a law and ethical behavior into obedience to such caprice. That's a problem. It's possible to impose laws Not just by force, not just by going up to people and saying, look, do what I say or I'm going to kill you or I'm going to punch you, or it'd be a terrible thing if your store here burned down, or I'm going to hurt your family, or I'm going to impose financial penalties on you, or we're going to use social pressure, all those sorts of things. That's one aspect of it. But there's another aspect where you have a arbitrary authority that's acting in a tyrannical way, and it's relying on the fact that there are honest consciousnesses out there who will receive the arbitrarily given law and say, well, it is the rules. I have to follow it. What would happen if I didn't do that? We see this dynamic over and over and over again, not just in terms of political communities, but also in terms of family dynamics. We also see this in the workplace. We see this in academia and our universities and colleges. We see this in so many different ways where some sort of authority gives us a rule, a law, a norm, and people say, well, I do have to follow it. But what does this mean? Hegel spells it out. Ethical behavior becomes obedience to caprice, obedience to arbitrariness. There's something fundamentally, I don't want to just say irrational, but corrupting and damaging to rationality, damaging to honesty involved in that. Hegel goes on. He says, obedience to laws, which are merely laws and not at the same time commandments. There's a distinction between laws or rules or regulations as given by a substantively rational agent and those that are given by an agent who is acting in a capricious, arbitrary, tyrannical, insolent way, seeing what they can get away with. That's on one side. Now, on the other side, we have this, freeing oneself, immunity, or exceptioning oneself from the law. He says, the second moment, insofar as it is isolated, means testing the laws, moving the immovable, means the insolence of a knowledge which argues itself into a freedom from absolute laws, treating them as an alien caprice. This is particularly interesting and something that we get to see quite often. Could be that the laws actually aren't capricious and are given by honest consciousness, legislating for the whole. But this action of testing laws itself can become corrupted. Itself can become, let's call it filled with a spirit of capriciousness, of me first, I get to decide, and insolence. You're not going to tell me what to do. It's quite possible to behave in a way that seems, on the surface, critical, rational, but really is just reflective of one's own desire to call the shots and to not have other people imposing norms upon you. And if those really are valid norms, and you do that, you're setting yourself at odds, not just with other people, but with something inherent to the very nature of rational self-consciousness. This is equally deforming, but deforming in a different way. It raises an interesting question, which Hegel doesn't go into here. If you have capricious laws being imposed by a tyrannical authority, and you also have somebody who, from their own egoism, is critiquing and accepting themselves from those laws, which one is worse? And is it good for this one to be doing that? Because they are removing themselves from an illegitimate, ungültige law? Interesting conundrum, isn't it? Not one that Hegel explores here, but it is one that I think could be raised at this point. What Hegel is keen to show us here is the contrast between two forms of consciousness in relation to laws.
In both forms, these moments are in negative relation to substance or real spiritual being. Or we may say that in them, substance does not as yet possess its reality, but rather that consciousness contains them still in the form of its own immediacy, and that substance is at first only a willing and knowing by this particular individual, or the ought to be of an unreal commandment and a knowledge of formal universality. But since these modes have been superseded, consciousness has returned into the universal, and those antitheses have vanished. Spiritual being is actual substance through these modes being valid, not in isolation, but only as superseded moments. And the unity in which they are merely moments is the self of consciousness, which being, from now on posited in the spiritual being, makes that being actual, fulfilled, and self-conscious.
In paragraph 435, Hegel is now beginning to bring matters to a head and tie them all together, preparing us for moving into the next main and massive section. You notice that he's already using here a term that is going to be the hallmark of the next section, geistige, spiritual, and we're trying to figure out what spirit actually is, while being parts of it and participating in it. So he says in both forms, what are the both forms? The two kinds of consciousnesses that we just looked at in the previous passage, the one that is arbitrary, the one that is honest. These moments are in negative relation to substance or to real spiritual being. So we start off by talking about real spiritual being, uses the term real there, geistige Wesen, and we could translate that as essence if we wanted. Being perhaps works well here at this point. And he says, or we may say in them that substance does not as yet possess its reality, but that consciousness contains them still in the form of its own immediacy. Immediacy meaning it has not figured out all the mediations, all the connections. It has not worked through them, but by the end of this, it will have worked through a good portion of them. So he says, and that substance is at first only a willing and knowing by this particular individual, right? Or the ought to be of an unreal commandment and knowledge of formal universality. So what we've got here is a kind of antithesis, right? We also have the antithesis over here. Well, I don't know if we want to call it an antithesis as such. Hegel does talk in the plural of antitheses. We have the law giving and the law testing that we've seen can't be dealt with adequately as isolated moments. But over here, what we're really focused on is this antithesis between the willing or knowing by the particular individual. Knowing what? Knowing moral norms, knowing the situation in which they have to act. Willing, choosing something. And then what Hegel calls an unreal commandment and a knowledge of formal universality. Well, that's the stuff that we've been talking about in the previous paragraphs. Knowledge of formal universality, knowing that something does not contain a contradiction in itself, in its sort of undeveloped notion, in its simple determinateness. Although it turns out that it always does have some sort of contradiction once we start playing it out, like with property or benevolence. So he goes on and he says, since these modes have been superseded, there is a little bit of a mistranslation, in part because it makes it a bit passive. Hegel uses the term, the verb aufheben there, right? And he's using it talking about these modes performing aufheben on themselves. They are superseding themselves, leading to this, right? So the aufheben is happening within consciousness of these moments that now have revealed themselves to be just parts of a larger whole. things that need to be reintegrated with each other. Modes is a translation of Weisen here. Ways would be another way of translating it. So he says, since these modes have been superseded, consciousness has returned into the universal, and those antitheses have vanished. Spiritual being, right? Real spiritual being is what? Actual substance, wirkliche Substanz, through these modes being valid. Not in isolation, right? Law-giving, law-testing, the individual, the universal, these are not valid, isolated out from each other, but only in their interconnection in consciousness, in the real spiritual being. So what does that mean? That means that the actual substance that is the real spiritual being is also going to be what Hegel calls here the self of consciousness. Right? They are superseded moments, these things, and the unity in which they are merely moments is the self of consciousness. Us, our self, our thinking. Which being from now on posited, he says, in the spiritual being, makes that being, notice, consciousness being in the spiritual being makes that actual, wirklich, fulfilled, erfüllt, and self-conscious. So it's not as if the spiritual being is there and it's just sort of like waiting for us to get the message and get our self-consciousnesses into it. No, this is something that is a hard-won spoil of victory of self-consciousness, trying to think through all of these things having to do with normativity and the universality of laws, law-giving, and law-testing.
The spiritual being thus exists first of all for self-consciousness as law, which has an intrinsic being. The universality associated with testing the law, a merely formal, not an essential universality, is now behind us. The law is equally an eternal law, which is grounded not in the will of a particular universal, but is valid in and for itself. It is the absolute pure will of all, which has the form of immediate being. Also, it is not a commandment, which only ought to be. It is and is valid. It is the universal I of the category, the I which is immediately a reality. And the world is only this reality. But since this existent law is valid unconditionally, the obedience of self-consciousness is not the serving of a master whose commands are arbitrary and in which it would not recognize itself. On the contrary, laws are the thoughts of its own absolute consciousness, thoughts which are immediately its own. Also, it does not believe in them, for although belief does perceive essential being, it perceives it as something alien to itself. Ethical self-consciousness is immediately one with essential being through the universality of itself. Belief, on the other hand, starts from the individual consciousness. It is the movement of that consciousness always towards this unity, but without attaining to the presence of its essential being. The above consciousness, on the other hand, has put its merely individual aspect behind it. This mediation is finished and complete, and only because this is so is this consciousness immediate self-consciousness of the ethical substance.
In paragraph 436, we are now almost on the cusp not only of finishing this pretty short section of reason as testing laws, or the larger section of individuality, real in and for itself, but the massive reason section itself. We are just one other paragraph away from making the transition between the two largest portions of this entire work. And what's happening here in this paragraph is, again, what I talked about in the previous one, a consolidation and a realization. We're seeing Aufhebung, sublation, this essential Hegelian concept at work right now. What do we have? Hegel talks now about the spiritual being existing first of all for self-consciousness as law which has an intrinsic being. No longer laws as they weren't there before and now they're given, or laws that we're testing. All of that is, to a certain extent, behind us. Not completely, but at this point at least. Law that has an intrinsic being. The universality associated with testing the law, a merely formal, not an essential universality, now behind us. Right? We're no longer to make appeals to these criteria of tautology or lack of self-contradiction. We're going to get into something more substantive. Now here's where he says something really interesting. The law is equally an eternal law, ewiges, eternal. This has some major resonances going far back into the history of philosophy. Who talks about eternal law? Well, you might, if you're inclined towards medieval philosophy, think in terms of Thomas Aquinas. Well, you should also think in terms of Augustine. You should think in terms of all these thinkers who thought there was some sort of intelligible normativity that encompassed everything. Hegel is using that language quite deliberately. A universal law. Or eternal law, rather. It is universal, of course, but it's eternal. What does he say about this? It's grounded not in the will of a particular individual, but valid in and for itself. It doesn't have its Grund, its foundation, in a particular individual. The particular individual, you could say, is preceded by this eternal law. And finds itself within the scope of that eternal law. So he says, it is the absolute pure will of all. That's another key feature of this. The absolute pure will of all. So this keeps it from being just, well, it's the eternal law, the way that, say, Thomas Aquinas conceived of it, God's mind, God's law, and then everything else sort of falls into place within it. No, this is going to be an important transformative moment. And he's not working further the implications of this out right now, but we are going to see this in the spirit and the religion section, and especially in absolute knowing. And it has the form, notice what he says here, of immediate being, unmittelbares Sein. So again, we have immediacy here. Looks like some pretty good immediacy, but immediacy is always a sign that there's more yet to come for Hegel. So what else does he say about this? He says, also, it's not a commandment, which only ought to be. The normativity that it has is not a shadowy quasi-normativity. It is a saturated, overloading things normativity. It is the universal I of the category, the I which is immediately a reality. And the world is only this reality. Why does he say the world is only this reality? Think back to the very beginning of the reason section. What was it that rational self-consciousness began with as its hallmark? It is the world. It is. The world is for it. Right? So now we have it in terms of this universal I. Now, how does this fit in with you and me? People, individual self-consciousnesses. It says, since this existent law is valid unconditionally, the obedience of self-consciousness is not the serving of a master whose commands are arbitrary and in which it would not recognize itself. So we already have two important moments here. There's obedience on the part of the self-consciousness. There is recognition. What does it recognize? He says, here we go. It recognizes itself. The laws are the thoughts of its own absolute consciousness, thoughts which are immediately its own. We are not just little bits and pieces of this eternal law. As consciousness, we're able to grasp it as us being part of that all in the pure will of all. So he goes on and he says, these are thoughts which are immediately its own. Now notice the next thing he says. It does not believe in them. Right? It doesn't have faith, you might say, in them. The same term, belief, faith, Glaube, right? Why not? Although belief does perceive essential being It perceives it as something alien to itself. Where have we seen this come up? Think back to the unhappy consciousness, right? This is not repeating the unhappy consciousness. There's something different going on here. Ethical self-consciousness, he says, is immediately one with essential being through the universality of itself. So insofar as there's something universal within us, we are able to participate in this. We are able to recognize it. We are able to obey it. We don't need to believe in it. We can be it. Belief, on the other hand, starts from the individual consciousness. It is the movement of that consciousness always towards that unity, but without attaining to the presence of its essential being. Now, Hegel goes on and he says, the above consciousness has put its merely individual aspect behind it. This mediation is finished and complete. Only because this is so is this consciousness immediate self-consciousness of the ethical substance. So if you can get yourself to that point, that sounds pretty awesome, doesn't it? Sounds like we finally attained the matter in hand, or core of the matter, the project, the Sache selbst that we were seeking. We finally reconciled the ethical substance that we had originally in the community with something that's now revealed as going way beyond any individual community or any individual person. And it's just up to us to do what? Identify with it, obey it, recognize it. That's part of what still has to be worked out. Remember, this is still, Hegel's using the term here, immediate. And so we're going to see further development taking place after this, much of which is going to happen in the spirit section.